Have you ever found yourself reacting with unexpected intensity to someone else's behavior? Maybe you've judged someone harshly for a trait you later recognized in yourself. Or perhaps you've made impulsive decisions that seem to come from nowhere, leaving you wondering, why did I do that? If these experiences sound familiar, you might be encountering what renowned psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow self, that hidden part of our psyche that exists beyond our conscious awareness. I'm fascinated by how this powerful psychological concept affects our daily lives, often without us realizing it. The shadow isn't simply our negative qualities. It's the aspects of ourselves we've tucked away, denied, or refused to acknowledge. It's the collection of traits, impulses, and desires that don't align with our conscious self-image or what society deems acceptable. What makes the shadow especially intriguing is that while we might think we've successfully buried these elements of our personality, they never truly disappear. Instead, they operate from the darkness, influencing our thoughts, reactions, and behaviors in surprising ways. The more forcefully we try to suppress these aspects of ourselves, the more power they gain in shaping our reality. Today, we're diving deep into 5 revealing signs that your shadow self might be taking the driver's seat in your life. Understanding these signs isn't about self-criticism, it's about illumination. By bringing awareness to these shadow dynamics, we open the door to greater self-understanding, authentic living, and ultimately, freedom from unconscious patterns that may be limiting your potential. The central insight of Jung's shadow concept is both profound and transformative. The parts of ourselves that we reject don't simply vanish. They become powerful unconscious forces that shape our lives in ways we don't recognize. When we refuse to acknowledge certain aspects of our personality, whether it's anger, vulnerability, ambition, or desire, these disowned qualities don't disappear. Instead, they operate from the shadows of our unconscious, emerging in disguised forms that can sabotage our relationships, career, and well-being. Jung believed that true psychological wholeness requires integrating these shadow elements rather than suppressing them. This integration process, what he called individuation, isn't about surrendering to our darkest impulses. Rather, it involves acknowledging these aspects of ourselves with consciousness and compassion, bringing them into the light where they can be transformed from destructive forces into sources of creativity, strength, and authenticity. This journey toward shadow integration represents one of life's most challenging yet rewarding psychological tasks. The alternative, continuing to deny these aspects of ourselves, leads to projection, self-sabotage, and a diminished sense of wholeness. When our shadow remains unacknowledged, we essentially live as partial versions of ourselves, with significant emotional energy tied up in keeping certain qualities locked away from our conscious awareness. Today's exploration of the 5 key signs your shadow is controlling your life offers a practical framework for beginning this integration process. By learning to recognize these shadow dynamics in action, you gain the opportunity to reclaim disowned aspects of yourself and channel their energy constructively, ultimately leading to greater psychological freedom and a more authentic expression of your complete self. Sign number 1. Intense emotional triggers and overreactions. One of the most revealing signs of shadow influence is experiencing disproportionate emotional reactions to certain people or situations. When someone's behavior triggers an intense, seemingly inexplicable response in you, whether it's rage, disgust, or even overwhelming attraction, you're likely encountering a reflection of your own shadow material. These moments of triggering occur because we're exceptionally sensitive to qualities in others that we've denied in ourselves. Your mind essentially creates a psychological alarm system that sounds whenever you encounter externally what you've rejected internally. That colleague whose confidence you find arrogant might be mirroring your own disowned ambition. The friend whose emotional vulnerability makes you uncomfortable might be reflecting aspects of sensitivity you've learned to suppress in yourself. These triggers aren't random. They're precise indicators of your shadow content. Notice when your response to someone seems outsized compared to the actual situation. Pay attention when you find yourself using extreme language. I can't stand people who, or I would never. These moments of intensity reveal the boundaries of your self-concept and point directly to where shadow work might be most valuable. What makes these triggers particularly challenging is that they feel completely justified in the moment. Your mind constructs a convincing narrative about why the other person is problematic, while concealing the true source of discomfort. The recognition of a disowned part of yourself. By approaching these triggering moments with curiosity rather than judgment, you create opportunities for profound self-discovery and growth, turning emotional landmines into gateways for greater self-understanding. Sign number 2, recurring patterns and self-sabotage. Another powerful indicator of shadow influence is finding yourself caught in repetitive patterns, despite your conscious intentions to change. You might repeatedly enter relationships with similar problematic dynamics, sabotage success just as you're about to achieve important goals, or fall into the same conflicts with different people across various areas of life. These patterns persist because they're driven by unconscious forces, shadow aspects operating beyond your awareness. Perhaps you consciously desire commitment, yet repeatedly choose unavailable partners. Maybe you want professional advancement, yet mysteriously undermine opportunities through procrastination or conflict. These contradictions between stated desires and actual behaviors often signal shadow material at work. What makes these patterns particularly frustrating is that conventional advice about goal setting and willpower proves ineffective against them. That's because you're not dealing with a simple lack of discipline or motivation. You're encountering deeper psychological forces that require understanding rather than just behavioral change. The shadow aspects driving these patterns often formed early in life as protective mechanisms, making them especially resistant to conscious control. Identifying these recurring themes requires honest self-reflection. Look for situations where you find yourself saying, "Why does this always happen to me?" Or, "How did I end up here again?" Notice when you feel stuck in cycles that seem beyond your control. These patterns aren't random misfortunes, but meaningful psychological data. They reveal how your shadow is influencing your choices below the threshold of awareness, creating outcomes that contradict your conscious intentions. Sign number 3, projection and harsh judgment of others. Projection represents one of the most common, yet least recognized manifestations of shadow influence. This psychological mechanism causes us to attribute our own unacknowledged qualities to others, essentially seeing outside what we refuse to see within. The intensity of your criticism toward others often correlates directly with your rejection of those same qualities in yourself. This dynamic appears in everyday judgments. The person who harshly criticizes others' financial choices while ignoring their own money mismanagement. The individual who fixates on others' attention-seeking behavior while unconsciously desiring more recognition themselves. The parent who cannot tolerate their child's anger while suppressing their own unexpressed rage. The shadow finds expression through projection because these qualities demand acknowledgement, if not internally, then externally through our preoccupation with these traits in others. What makes projection particularly challenging to recognize is that it always contains a grain of truth. The person you're judging may indeed possess the quality you're noticing. However, the emotional charge behind your judgment reveals more about your relationship to this quality than about the other person. Notice when your criticisms feel righteous or when you find yourself preoccupied with another's behavior that doesn't directly affect you. Jung famously noted that recognizing projections requires asking a difficult question. What qualities am I most critical of in others? The answers provide a remarkably accurate map of your shadow territory, the traits that evoke your strongest judgments, whether it's selfishness, neediness, arrogance, or irresponsibility, often represent disowned aspects of yourself, seeking integration. By approaching these judgments with curiosity rather than certainty, you transform projection from an unconscious habit into an opportunity for self-discovery. Sign number 4, unexplained attraction and fascination. While shadow content often emerges through negative emotions like anger or judgment, it equally manifests through powerful positive attractions and fascinations. The qualities, people, and situations that inexplicably draw you in can reveal as much about your shadow as those you reject. These intense attractions often represent encounters with your disowned potential, aspects of yourself you've learned to suppress, but still yearn to express. Consider the quiet person who feels magnetically drawn to charismatic performers, the practical individual fascinated by artistic expression despite never pursuing creative outlets, or the disciplined professional secretly captivated by those who live spontaneously and break rules. These attractions often reflect not just admiration but recognition. You're encountering externally what exists internally as untapped potential. This dynamic explains why people sometimes develop intense fascinations with particular personalities, lifestyles, or even fictional characters that embody qualities they've denied in themselves. The energy behind these attractions stems from the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness, a recognition, however unconscious, of what's missing in your expressed personality. What makes these fascinations particularly revealing is their persistence, despite lack of obvious external rewards. Notice what captures your attention repeatedly, what you find yourself drawn to without logical explanation. Ask yourself, what qualities in others consistently fascinate me, and what lives or experiences do I find myself drawn to without taking steps to create them? These attractions aren't random, but meaningful. They're your shadow aspects seeking expression, offering clues about parts of yourself awaiting integration and development. Sign number 5, incongruent self-image and feedback. The final sign of shadow influence appears in the gap between how you perceive yourself and how others experience you. When you consistently receive feedback that contradicts your self-image, you're likely encountering shadow material. This discrepancy often reveals blind spots where your shadow operates without your awareness. This dynamic manifests when someone who considers themselves open-minded repeatedly hears they're rigid in certain areas. When a self-described good listener learns others find them dominating conversations, or when someone who values honesty discovers others perceive them as selectively transparent. These contradictions aren't simply misunderstandings. They're valuable data about your shadow aspects in action. What makes this sign particularly challenging is that it threatens your conscious identity. When faced with feedback that contradicts how you see yourself, the natural response is defensiveness rather than curiosity. Yet these moments offer rare glimpses of your shadow at work, showing how qualities you've disowned express themselves despite your conscious intentions and self-perception. This dynamic appears not just in direct feedback, but in recurring relationship patterns. Notice when multiple people in different contexts respond to you in surprisingly similar ways. Pay attention when you find yourself saying, "That's not what I meant," or "You're misinterpreting me," across various relationships. These patterns aren't coincidences but indicators of how your shadow aspects communicate beyond your awareness. By approaching these discrepancies with openness rather than defensiveness, you gain access to powerful self-knowledge otherwise unavailable to you. The gap between your self-image and others' experience of you isn't a problem to fix but valuable information. A window into aspects of yourself operating outside your conscious control, seeking acknowledgement and integration. While identifying shadow influences can be transformative, we must approach this work with nuance and avoid oversimplification. Not every emotional reaction indicates shadow material, and not all feedback from others accurately reflects your disowned qualities. Sometimes your intense responses stem from legitimate values or boundaries, rather than projection, and others' perceptions may sometimes reveal more about their issues than your own shadow aspects. The concept of the shadow itself has valid critiques within psychology. Some argue that Jung's model can sometimes lead to excessive self-focus or become a framework where everything gets attributed to shadow material, overlooking genuine external factors. Others note that cultural context matters. Significantly, what constitutes shadow varies across cultural backgrounds, as different societies encourage or discourage different traits. What might represent shadow content in one cultural context might be actively cultivated in another. Additionally, shadow work isn't always accessible or appropriate as an immediate priority. During periods of acute stress, trauma, or crisis, focusing directly on shadow material can sometimes be overwhelming rather than helpful. In these situations, establishing safety and stability might need to precede deeper psychological exploration. Timing and support matter tremendously in this work. Some psychologists also emphasize that shadow integration doesn't mean uncritically embracing every disowned impulse. Discernment remains essential. The goal isn't to act on every suppressed tendency, but to bring consciousness to these aspects, understanding their underlying needs while choosing constructive expressions. Integration means transformation, rather than simply unleashing previously controlled impulses. Despite these important qualifications, the core insight remains powerful. Unacknowledged aspects of ourselves significantly influence our lives whether we recognize them or not. The value of shadow work lies not in creating another rigid framework, but in developing greater self-awareness that allows for more conscious, intentional living rather than being unconsciously driven by unexamined psychological content. Beginning shadow work doesn't require dramatic lifestyle changes or intensive therapy. Although professional support can certainly be valuable, you can start this integration process through simple daily practices that build self-awareness and gradually illuminate your disowned aspects. Start by creating a trigger journal, where you record situations that provoke unexpectedly strong emotional responses. Note what happened, your reaction, and any thoughts that accompanied the feeling. Over time, patterns will emerge, revealing consistent triggers that point to specific shadow content. The key is suspending judgment. Approach these observations with curiosity rather than self-criticism. Another practical approach involves examining your relationship with societal expectations. Ask yourself, what qualities was I discouraged from expressing as a child? And which traits does my social circle or professional environment implicitly devalue? Often shadow content forms around qualities deemed unacceptable by our families or communities. Identifying these external influences helps understand how your shadow developed. For addressing projection, practice what Jung called taking back projections through a simple reflection exercise. When strongly judging someone, pause and ask, how might this quality exist within me? Perhaps in a different form. This doesn't mean invalidating your perception, but exploring how the trait might manifest in your own life, perhaps in subtler or disguised ways. Shadow integration also happens through creative expression. Activities like journaling, art, movement, or even dream work provide channels for shadow content to emerge safely. These approaches bypass cognitive defenses by engaging different modes of expression, allowing disowned aspects to find voice through symbolic or nonverbal forms. Perhaps most importantly, cultivate self-compassion throughout this process. Shadow material often contains qualities we learned to hide because they felt shameful or unacceptable. Approaching these aspects with kindness, rather than criticism, creates the psychological safety necessary for integration. Remember that acknowledging your shadow isn't about self-judgment, but about reclaiming the energy and wholeness that comes from self-acceptance. Imagine living with a constant companion who knows all your secrets, influences your decisions, and shapes your relationships, yet remains completely invisible to you. This silent presence affects everything from your career choices to your love life, from your friendships to your self-concept, yet you've never properly met. This is the reality of living with an unacknowledged shadow, carrying within yourself a powerful force that operates beyond your awareness, yet profoundly impacts your life's direction. Consider Sarah, who prides herself on always putting others first. Throughout her life, she's been the caretaker, the reliable friend who never asks for help. She genuinely believes she doesn't need recognition or assistance, yet she finds herself increasingly resentful toward colleagues who freely request support or friends who accept her help without reciprocating. Despite her conscious belief that she doesn't need acknowledgement, she feels increasingly empty and unappreciated. Sarah's unacknowledged needs for recognition, support, and reciprocity haven't disappeared simply because she's disowned them. Instead, they've gone underground, emerging as resentment, fatigue, and an inexplicable sense of being unseen. Her shadow, containing natural, human needs for recognition and support, seeks expression through these indirect channels because she hasn't allowed these needs conscious acknowledgement. The emotional toll of this disconnect between conscious identity and shadow aspects can be enormous, creating not just psychological strain but also physical manifestations through stress and tension. The energy required to keep certain aspects of yourself constantly suppressed depletes vitality that could otherwise contribute to creative expression, authentic relationships, and genuine fulfillment. Shadow integration offers a different possibility. One, where your psychological energy isn't consumed by keeping parts of yourself hidden but becomes available for growth and authentic connection. Imagine the liberation of no longer being triggered by certain personalities, the freedom of breaking persistent negative patterns, the relief of aligning your self-perception with your actual experience. This journey toward wholeness represents one of life's most challenging yet ultimately rewarding psychological tasks. The journey of shadow integration follows a recognizable progression, moving through distinct phases as disowned aspects gradually return to consciousness. Understanding this developmental arc can help normalize the sometimes challenging experiences that accompany this profound psychological work. The process typically begins with awareness, moments of recognition where you start noticing patterns in your triggers, projections, and recurring situations. These realizations often arrive unexpectedly, sometimes through relationships that mirror your disowned qualities or through life crises that strip away familiar defenses. While these moments may initially feel uncomfortable, they represent essential first glimpses of your shadow content coming into view. As awareness deepens, you'll likely experience a period of resistance, a natural protective response as your psyche confronts aspects of yourself that were previously off-limits. This resistance might manifest as defensiveness, rationalization, or even physical discomfort. You might find yourself thinking, "That's not really me," or "I'm nothing like that." This resistance doesn't indicate failure, but actually confirms you're engaging with meaningful material. Your psychological immune system is responding to perceived threats to your identity. With continued compassionate awareness, resistance gradually gives way to acceptance, recognizing these disowned qualities as legitimate aspects of your humanity rather than flaws to eliminate. This acceptance doesn't mean uncritical surrender to every impulse, but rather an acknowledgement of these aspects' existence and understanding their underlying needs and origins. You begin seeing how these shadow qualities formed as adaptations to earlier life circumstances, often as protection against vulnerability or rejection. The final phase involves integration, finding conscious, constructive expressions for previously disowned qualities. The ambitious drive you once projected onto pushy colleagues becomes healthy self-advocacy. The vulnerability you criticized as weakness in others becomes authentic emotional expression in your relationships. The creative impulses you dismissed as impractical find appropriate channels through new pursuits or approaches to existing activities. This integration process doesn't happen all at once, but unfolds gradually across different aspects of your shadow. Some elements integrate more easily, while others require longer periods of awareness and acceptance before finding healthy expression. Throughout this developmental journey, compassion serves as the essential companion, allowing you to acknowledge all facets of yourself with understanding rather than judgment. As we conclude our exploration of shadow dynamics, I invite you to begin your own journey of shadow integration with a simple yet powerful reflection exercise. Take a few moments right now to consider what qualities in others consistently trigger strong emotional reactions in you. Which types of personalities do you find most difficult or most fascinating? These responses provide valuable clues about your own shadow content, aspects of yourself, awaiting recognition and integration. Notice the resistance that might arise as you consider these questions. That resistance itself contains valuable information, often indicating proximity to significant shadow material. Where you feel defensive or dismissive might be precisely where the most important insights await. Remember that acknowledging your shadow isn't about self-criticism, but about reclaiming psychological energy currently tied up in keeping certain aspects of yourself hidden from awareness. Moving forward, commit to approaching your emotional triggers with curiosity rather than automatic reaction. When you feel disproportionately activated by someone's behavior, pause and ask yourself, what might this reveal about aspects of myself I've disowned? This single practice, meeting triggers with inquiry rather than certainty, can dramatically shift your relationship with your shadow over time. Consider keeping a shadow journal for the next 2 weeks, recording situations that provoke unexpectedly strong reactions, recurring patterns in your relationships, and moments where feedback from others contradicts your self-perception. Look for themes and connections across these experiences, approaching them as valuable data rather than problems to solve. Finally, remember that shadow work represents one of life's most profound opportunities for growth and transformation. By beginning to acknowledge and integrate these disowned aspects of yourself, you're not just addressing specific psychological challenges, you're engaging in the essential human journey toward greater wholeness, authenticity, and freedom. The question isn't whether you have a shadow, we all do. The question is whether you'll allow it to operate unconsciously or engage with it consciously, transforming what was once a source of limitation into a wellspring of vitality and self-understanding. The shadow, as Jung conceptualized it, represents not a dark stain to eliminate, but a reservoir of unlived potential awaiting integration. Throughout this exploration, we've examined 5 key signs that indicate shadow influence: intense emotional triggers, recurring self-sabotaging patterns, projection onto others, unexplained attractions, and incongruence between self-image and feedback. Each of these signs offers a doorway into greater self-awareness, an opportunity to recognize and reclaim aspects of yourself operating beyond conscious control. Shadow integration doesn't mean unrestrained expression of every impulse or embracing destructive tendencies. Rather, it involves bringing consciousness to previously unconscious content, understanding its origins and underlying needs, and finding constructive channels for its expression. This integration process transforms psychological energy previously consumed by repression into a source of creativity, authenticity, and vitality. The journey of shadow work reflects the broader human developmental arc from fragmentation toward wholeness. When we deny certain aspects of our humanity, whether vulnerability or ambition, anger or desire, we essentially live as partial versions of ourselves, with significant psychological energy tied up in maintaining these internal divisions. Shadow integration offers the possibility of reclaiming this energy and experiencing life with greater internal coherence and external authenticity. As we conclude, remember that shadow work isn't about reaching a perfect end state, where all unconscious material becomes conscious. Such complete integration remains an aspirational horizon rather than an achievable destination. The value lies in the ongoing process, the gradual illumination of previously dark corners of your psyche and the compassionate incorporation of disowned aspects into your conscious identity. In this journey toward psychological wholeness, curiosity proves more valuable than judgment, and compassion more useful than criticism. By approaching your shadow with these qualities, you transform what Jung called the path of individuation from a theoretical concept into a lived reality, cultivating greater authenticity, diminishing unconscious reactivity, and moving toward the person you're capable of becoming. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Jung's shadow concept and its manifestations in everyday life. If you found value in understanding these dynamics, please share this video with someone who might benefit from these insights. Remember that shadow work represents not just personal psychological growth, but a contribution to collective consciousness. As we integrate our individual shadows, we become less likely to project our disowned qualities onto others, creating more authentic connections and communities. For deeper exploration of Jungian concepts and practical shadow work, I recommend starting with Robert Johnson's accessible book, Owning Your Own Shadow, or Debbie Ford's The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, both offering straightforward approaches to this complex psychological territory. You'll find links to these resources in the description below. If today's discussion resonated with you, consider subscribing for more content exploring psychological concepts with practical applications. In upcoming videos, we'll examine related topics including dream analysis, archetype recognition, and specific shadow integration practices for different personality types. Until next time, remember that the journey toward wholeness begins not with perfection, but with honest self-acknowledgement. In Jung's own words, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Thank you for your presence and attention. I look forward to continuing this journey together.